Let's talk about the role of women in the Klan. I found this fascinating. And I mean, just tell us a little bit. Maybe you highlight three women: Elizabeth Tyler, Daisy Barr, I think it is, and Alina White, who sort of, I guess, represent three different aspects of the Klan, between the public relations, the sort of money, the profiteering, and the religious aspects. But broadly speaking, the role of women in the Klan.
Well, women clamored to join the Klan, and they developed an organization that came together eventually. It was called the WKKK, the Women's Ku Klux Klan. It was smaller, but it had about 1.5 million people. Furthermore,
and we should say at this time, that's close to almost, I guess, 1.5% of what the American population was, roughly speaking, around that time.
Yeah. And also, I think we have to keep in mind that there's no evidence that they joined because their husbands joined or because their husbands wanted them to. And in fact, they actually became, not all of them, but some of their groups became very feisty in resisting the male domination of the Klan. For example, some of these groups began to refuse, when you had a little Klan chapter, a proportion of all the dues was also supposed to be sent up to the national headquarters. Some of these women's chapters just began refusing to do that. They wanted to control all their own money. But I think I think there were two things that led me to do that separate chapter. One is that I think it's really important not to imagine that women are necessarily a kinder, gentler group that are less able to get involved in this kind of bigoted, racist stuff. But the other thing that surprised me was that in some cases, you actually had women in the Klan who were agitating for reforms that we really have to call feminist. This was particularly true in the writings of one of the women you mentioned, called Alma White, who was a bishop in an evangelical, a small evangelical sect, and she was apparently a very charismatic speaker, and she published book after book after book of her sermons, and as well as her publishing a newspaper. And you see that the things that she's asking for are not so different from what suffragists had been asking for in the previous decade. She wanted women's property rights. She asked for greater prosecution of abusive men. She wanted women to have better access to higher education. I've gotten quite a bit of pushback about that chapter because, again, I think there are people, including some friends of mine, who like to think that you should only use the label feminist for someone who is progressive on a whole range of issues, including being anti-racist. But I think we have to be honest about that and say that there are certain versions of feminism that are quite compatible with a bigoted movement like that of the Klan.
And the Klan itself was, in this era, was supportive of a woman's right to vote. A white woman's right to vote, right? Because was the thinking, was that because the Klan was electing a lot of people, not secretly, right? I mean, people were running not quite as the Klan's candidate, but sort of as the Klan's candidate, and winning.
Well, they were running as Klansmen, in which their identification was open. They were running in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and they managed to elect 11 governors, something like 45 members of Congress, and thousands, or at least hundreds and hundreds of local officials, state, county, municipal officials. They had a very sophisticated electoral strategy. The only thing that I didn't put in the book in the form of an appendix, which you probably noticed, is at the very back there is a chart that was created by the Klan that lists all the senators with, in this chart, their evaluation, the Klan's evaluation of how friendly that senator was to Klan ideas. And I wouldn't be surprised if they had the same kind of information that they put out about Congress people. They were masters at getting the vote out, and they were also masters at lobbying and at intimidating politicians by threatening that they would use all their votes against them if the politicians didn't go along with what they wanted.
We should say that this is a big part of both right and left politics, although the right has these, sort of weaponized the way that they score. The Heritage Foundation will give you a score if you're a representative on based upon how you vote and taking those positions. I mean, did they pioneer that? Did the Klan pioneer that, or was there a precursor to that?
To this working to get out the vote, you mean?
Not so much working to get out the vote, but this is a modern feature of politics where, Club
absolutely.
for Growth will score you. I mean, was the Klan the first outside group to do that?
I doubt it. I don't know that for sure, but I doubt it. In political machines operated all over, and I'm sure that there were other organizations that tried to influence or more sharply to intimidate politicians. And of course, there were all sorts of ways in which people were literally buying votes in these days. So there was nothing new about that. I think what's new is that people don't usually associate that with a mass movement or with an organization like the Ku Klux Klan, because I think most people's images of the Klan have to do with violence. Now, this 1920s Klan was not 100% nonviolent. They were mostly nonviolent, but the fact is that I think they figured out that they could get further with an electoral strategy than they could by violence or by threatening violence. But there were exceptions. For example, in the West Coast, where you at that time didn't have very many African Americans, but you did have Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, the Klan was very, very flexible, kind of an equal opportunity set of racism. So they would go after whoever were the sort of disadvantaged people in a particular area. They constantly attacked Mexican Americans in California and Oregon and Washington, where there were many Japanese American farmers. They even lynched some of them. So they did engage in some violence. And also they liked to have these raids against saloons. This is Prohibition, remember. And as evangelicals, they are officially supporters of Prohibition, although there were a lot of scandals because the Klan's people would get caught drinking. But the Klan's official propaganda was that it was only Catholics who drank, and that it was only Jews who were the bootleggers. So they could racialize their attitudes about Prohibition. Also, the Klan violence has to do with something else that's an extremely important fact to understand this. And in this sense, it probably is similar to the first Klan. In the second Klan, the largest occupational category per capita in relation to its size in the Klan were police officers or sheriffs or law and order officers. And the many local Klan chapters had very, very close relationships with local police forces. The police forces in several locations simply deputized large numbers of Klanspeople. There are places where policemen were allowed to do their regular patrols in Klan uniforms. Even in a place like Madison, Wisconsin, which people think of these days as a relatively liberal place, the police chief said that his police force was pretty thoroughly Klanified, as he put it.
And this is we should remind people, we're talking about the second wave, right? I mean, the
1920s. In the 1920s, yes.
Okay. I mean, that's stunning to me.
Yeah, it is. It is. There's one interesting anecdote about this vigilantism that I think many of your listeners may even have been familiar with, because it is described in the autobiography of Malcolm X. It is about how some Klansmen on horseback really terrified and threatened his family and drove them out. And this happened literally when Malcolm X's mother was pregnant with him. And it was certainly must have been an absolutely terrifying experience.